Welcome to CHI's Masters of Suspicion class on the American Gothic. This is week 2, the Gothic's Rambling Logic. It's a little bit of a review. Last week we touched briefly on the nature of the American Gothic and the ways that it helps readers to focus on the kinds of ethical problems that dominate ethical theories, or that dominant ethical theories are either able to justify or ignore. We looked at the role of the uncanny and the American Gothic's obsession with the sight of the home, and touched on ways that the Gothic helps readers become habituated with the kinds of emotions that are either negated or numbed in the everyday world. Joy, wonder, terror, confusion. With its refusal to embrace common assumptions about life, American Gothic authors propelled readers into spaces marked by suspicion by integrating the impossible within the context of the everyday. As a preview, today we'll examine Washington Irving's well-known Sketchbook of Geoffrey Crayon. Although if you read the entirety of the sketchbook in modern times, almost everyone retains some familiarity with its two most popular inclusions, Winkle and Winkle and The Legend of Sleepy Hollow. Irving had the virtue of being one of early America's most notable authors, achieving transatlantic success, although this was likely due in part to the amount of time that he also spent in Europe. His use of the Gothic remains anchored to a sense of humor. Overall, its effect is to expose the possibilities that the Gothic offers for making life more interesting, delightful, and wonderful. Today's lesson will focus on how he orients readers to a more expansive definition of truth that, in turn, helps open readers to more possibilities for life. Although written by Irving, the book is credited to the narrator, Geoffrey Crayon, and interspersed with two stories credited to Dietrich Knickerbocker, who not only gives the Knicks its nickname, but also helps to explain Irving's playful use of the world of fact as a space of mystery and delight. So, the first story I'll discuss is that which opens the book, the author's account of himself. This story gently introduces readers to a rambling logic at odds with the mechanistic determinism spawned by a more Franklinian worldview. The logic he introduces at this point is an uncanny logic, one that undermines the precision and certainty desired by those who value control by creating points of indeterminacy through the juxtaposition of two worlds not commonly understood in tandem. At first, this type of overlap is relatively mild. Crayon writes, quote, "As I grew into boyhood, I extended the range of my observations. My holiday afternoons were spent in rambles about the surrounding country. I made myself familiar with all its places famous in history or fable. I knew every spot where a murder or robbery had been committed, or a ghost seen." In this initial point in the sketch, Irving ascribes validity to different stories of past events, refusing to differentiate between history and fable, which follows here the example of his Knickerbocker's History of New York. He also does not distinguish between spots featuring robbery, murder, or ghosts. Irving's indifference to these issues invites readers to understand how history and fable each speak to human violence, to appreciate how places carry memories of murder and theft, and how, at times, ghosts mark such spots. American readers in the early 19th century, personally familiar with the expropriation of Native American bodies and the violence that attended the work of colonization and settlement, would be more prone than 21st century readers to view the surrounding landscape as haunted by the ghosts of indigenous dwellers. A willingness to see ghosts, framed through history or fable, transforms the countryside into a place laden with history. Crayon serves as a model for how to ramble through the world, attending to stories that interpret the world's violence without rejecting the possibilities opened by other worlds. Allowing Crayon to age slightly, Irving writes, quote, "This rambling propensity strengthened with my years. Books of voyage and travels became my passion, and in devouring their contents, I neglected the regular exercises of the school." By employing different senses of the term ramble in close proximity, Irving suggests how literature and landscape each serve to transport readers into unknown worlds. Promoting the function of textual settings in general allows Irving to indirectly emphasize the function that landscape and setting play in his work in particular. This narrative decision undermines assumptions that cede absolute power and control to consciousness. Irving reveals how the seeming givenness of our surrounding world depends on texts, history, legend, fable, or news, and these texts provide a background for our responses. Additionally, Irving suggests that the world grasps or gathers humans into its physical spaces in ways that the school's regular exercises, which are focused only on facts from the true books, might obscure. Literature and landscapes each satisfy and simultaneously encourage the narrator's wanderlust, allowing different senses of the world to explore. Irving's choice to juxtapose stories and spaces, connecting them with the logic of a ramble, shows an intentional possibility for how we live. Being willing to ramble beyond direction, becoming passionate about rambles, enables us to enter into a Gothic lifestyle. The rest of the book presents Crayon as a rambler, one who moves about without a given purpose or direction, one who remains open to the stories and spaces he encounters. Each of the subsequent sketches reinforces this attitude, a lesson Irving teaches at the level of the sentence, as we saw above, as well as through the moral of almost each individual sketch. As a protagonist, Crayon is disinclined towards seeing the major sights of the places he visits, but contents himself instead with out-of-the-way places that he simply happens upon as he rambles. His rambles, at a mental level, allow him to incorporate other kinds of sketches, like that of Roscoe, which seem to have little to do with his travels at all. Ramblers are an itinerant lot who find comfort in their own homelessness. In this way, the uncanny lurks at the heart of each of the rambles, as Crayon finds that a willingness to ramble opens up what is familiar, in spite of the fact that each new space remains strange. This opens through Irving's work to interpret the world in ways that allow readers to become at ease with being dispossessed of a sense of home as a guarded and protected space, and, instead, more familiar with an attitude that allows readers to make themselves at home wherever they are. Irving's ethic is particular here. The example that Crayon sets is not an imperialistic one that would impose one's own sense of home onto an alien landscape, the way that the colonists did to the New World. Instead, as an alternative, Irving encourages readers to let go of any sense of imposition and to substitute for it an open willingness to take the world as it comes. Irving's constant use of Gothic tropes and themes does much to allow Crayon to feel at home in strange places. In other words, because Crayon views all landscapes through the alienating lens of the Gothic, he can feel equally at home within all of them. The Gothic, in other words, becomes a device that allows the strangeness of each new space to speak to its own strangeness. In other words, instead of filtering his travels by looking for what is familiar, the way that all too many of us do when we escape to McDonald's or Applebee's when visiting a new city, he searches for what is familiar in its strangeness in ways that allow the peculiarities of each new place to speak. One example of this occurs in The Art of Bookmaking, a sketch where Irving frames Crayon's visits to the British Library using explicit Gothic tropes. For example, the door to the library opens, quote, with that facility with which the portals of enchanted castles yield to the adventurous knight-errant, unquote, and he suspects that the room he enters, filled with slips of paper that results in the retrieval of books, represent, quote, a body of magi, but he finds that they're principally authors, and in the very act of manufacturing books. Such rambling fancies, quote, send Crayon to sleep. In the sketch The Mutability of Literature, Irving once more features a scene combining dreaming and books. The sketch begins as Crayon finds himself in one of the, quote, certain half-dreaming moods of mind in which we naturally steal away from noise and glare and seek some quiet haunt where we may indulge our reveries and build our air castles undisturbed, unquote. So inclined, Crayon enters the library buried in the heart of Westminster Abbey, once again invoking a series of explicit Gothic tropes. A lofty antique hall, soberly lighted by a row of Gothic windows that was buried deep among the massive walls of the Abbey and shut out from the tumult of the world, and constituted a kind of literary catacomb, where authors, like mummies, are piously entombed and left to blacken and molder in dusty oblivion. The entirety of the scene sets forth the fantastical promise of neglected items everyone overlooks. Endowing each place with a Gothic lens allows Crayon to intentionally see the world as if it were something else. It highlights what's familiar about each place's strangeness and allows them to merge the world of the Gothic with the everyday world. Both of the spaces mentioned above, the library and the abbey, are spaces that wouldn't require the type of interpretive viewing that Irving offers. Imposing this fantastical world over the extant mundane one allows Crayon to become an active participant in co-creating an uncanny world. Taking such descriptions only half seriously allows the world to remain doubled instead of falling into a unified field. One experiences life's most audacious possibilities while acknowledging at the same time that such experiences are all in fun. This perhaps prevents one from falling into the trap of Don Quixote, where one isn't sure whether or not he realizes he's having fun, but one suspects that he is. Now into Winkle. What we talked about just now sets up the story of Irving and Winkle, which, as mentioned earlier, is not one of Crayon's rambles, but instead is found in the papers of Dietrich Knickerbocker. The story begins with a henpecked husband who wanders in the woods, finds a group of thirsty men, and drinks a draught that sends him sleeping for a good long spell. He's unaware of this, of course, and wakes only to be disconcerted by the absence of his dog and his gun. The whole of this is set up initially to inspire a sense of the uncanny, as Rip is confronted with a world that is simultaneously strange and familiar. The uncanny emerges as the familiar geographical place, complete with particular familiar markers, has been recontextualized in ways that Rip does not understand. He's rendered homeless. A series of events displace him. He finds that he recognizes nobody in the town. Those he meets have, quote, dress of a different fashion from what he had known. And beyond this, quote, a troop of strange men at his heels, laughing at the foot-long beard that Rip is astonished to have grown. Rip cannot recognize his own external appearance. Further, the village itself had altered. His familiar haunts had disappeared, and strange names were over the doors, strange faces at the window. Everything was strange. He finds his old house empty, forlorn, and apparently abandoned, literalizing his sense of homelessness. On learning that his friends had disappeared, Rip's heart dies, quote, at hearing of these sad changes in his home and friends, and finding himself thus alone in the world, end quote. Although Irving subtracts even this from Rip, as, quote, he doubted his own identity, and whether he was himself or another man. Rip is alienated from his world, sundered from his identity, and wholly lost until an unfamiliar woman comforts a child startled by Rip's haggard, bearded appearance with a "Hush, Rip." The woman, his daughter, reveals that he has been asleep for 20 years, and Rip is soon reunited with his family, including his son, a ditto of himself. The story concludes with Rip, aged, idle with impunity, gossiping at the end. At the level of the explicit Gothic, the uncanny arises when Rip is reintroduced to his world and finds himself staring into a countenance that he remembered as his own, although it's a face that no longer fits him. Beyond Rip's initial moment of confusion when his rifle is replaced by a gun with a rusted forelock, his hungover mind interpreting this as engineered by the Mirthless Party, Irving consistently uses the term strange to discuss Rip's re-entry into his native village. The exploration of his house symbolizes his experience of the whole. Although recognizable, what made the house and village home has vanished. The remnants are familiar enough to ensure that the fact is uncanny and not simply alien. It eliminates the possibility that Rip simply got lost on his way home and has entered an altogether entirely different village. Irving's including a man sharing Rip's former features, attitude, and name emphasize the uncanny, as what Rip found familiar becomes strange, or estranged from him. It's externally displaced onto another body. This detail, in particular, allows Rip's return to feature the uncanny conjunction of two different worlds, a vision of the past Rip and the future. Irving uses the uncanny to invoke the appearance of identity despite the passage of 20 years, but the story's conclusion transforms an analogous situation into a punchline. Earlier, Irving mentions that Rip and his friends enjoy chatting outside an inn designated by a rubicund portrait of His Majesty George III. During Rip's frantic desire to find familiar anchors to his world, he finds that the sign, quote, was singularly metamorphosed. The red coat was changed for one of blue and buff, a sword in the hand instead of a scepter. The head was decorated with a cocked hat, and underneath was painted in large characters, General Washington. Although Rip experiences the sign as change, readers recognize it just signifies that the changes is superficial and undeliberate. The change is nothing to Irving clarified the foundation. Changes of sires make, but there is a despotism under which he had long grown was. Freedom comes with death of Dingle, and the local law domestic its Detroit individual. And all, Irving's situation for readers, pushing to one point that deviating on reflective perspectives might anticipate. The first conflict arises relative to the custody of Washington. When this is first neighbors are seen to wink at each other and put their tongues in their cheeks, and when the self-important man shakes his head, there's a general shaking of the head throughout the assemblage. Only after Peter Vanderdonk, whom overdetermined man of authority, calling him a descendant of a historian of that name, and the most ancient inhabitant of the village, and well-versed in all the wonderful events and traditions of the neighborhood, corroborates have always been being. Some people accept and debating the upcoming election. By the end, this wins by repetition. Rip tells his story to strangers, and the Dutch townspeople almost universally give it full credit. Although details vary the first times he narrated the story, deviations were attributed to his having so recent. Irving's statement to death insisted that Rip had been out of his head, but described a fantastic fantastical stories predicted out inspires readers toward a soft willingness to accept the incredible. Irving enables readers to embrace belief by rendering plausible interpretations in banal terms, provoking the reader's desire to enjoy less realistic alternatives. Simply put, it's more pleasant to believe the possibility that Rip had an evil supernatural than the merely uncanny possibility that Rip left town to escape his wife. By rendering a mundane interpretation joyless, Irving allows the story to conclude with a wink that nudges readers to accept the possibility of the marvelous interpretation. In other words, concerning the story seem to perpetuates an interesting question, and in no way will it arrive at an answer. Beyond allowing readers to become comfortable with suspending disbelief and embracing the pleasure of mystery, the conflict between interpretations raised in the conclusion also points readers to a foundational tension concerning the nature of truth. This fissure began in a note preceding the story, in which Irving frames the tale as found papered by Dietrich Knickerbocker, whose research, quote, did not lie so much among books as among men, because the former were lamentably scanty on his favorite topics, whereas he found the old burghers, and still more their wives, rich in that legendary lore, so invaluable to true history. Irving raises a conflicting perspective concerning what true history might mean in an account that destabilizes the nature of any authority to be able to guarantee truth. He begins by writing, quote, its chief merit is its scrupulous accuracy, quote, which, given Knickerbocker's method of research, reveals that an accurate account of the story will carry with it all of the biases that informed the interpretation of an event that led to the story. Arguing that his accuracy, quote, indeed was a little questioned on its first appearance, but has since been completely established, quote, is put into a tellingly and unsettlingly passive voice. Although ostensibly meant to comfort readers that the account was not naively taken as true, the work of concealing those who established the story's veracity and the mystery of what standards were used only complicates the question of what truth might mean. The final clause adds, quote, it is now admitted into all historical collections as a book of unquestionable authority, ultimately enshrouding all historical collections and authorities with the same misgivings that Knickerbocker's True Histories induces in readers inclined toward critical thought. Irving structures the account, in other words, to show how Knickerbocker's idiosyncratic belief in the marvelous, which he is always disinclined to doubt, is potentially echoed in any given historical account where the stakes might matter more. Relative to questions of truth, Irving effectively causes his readers to doubt authorized versions of events. Viewing history through the lens of folklore and viewing folklore as a version of history reveals the haunting need for a third perspective outside both types of truth, adjudicating between them. By allowing the reader to occupy this space of authority, readers are disabused of their naive assumptions regarding authority and truth and show the fragility of the line that separates them. The final juxtaposition of competing paradigms occurs in the juxtaposed source for Knickerbocker's story, which never relinquishes its own claim to truth. In the note at the story's end, readers are told that, quote, the foregoing tale had been suggested to Mr. Knickerbocker by a little German superstition, quote, although Knickerbockers know the test of the story's veracity. The postscript after the note offers an alternative, claiming, with an emphasis on names, that the Katzberg or Catskill Mountains have always been a region full of fable. This is reinforced in the next sentence, quote, the Indians considered them the abode of spirits ruled by an old squaw spirit said to be their mother. The account continues, in the old times, saying in Indian traditions, there was a kind of Manitou, or spirit, who took a mischievous pleasure in wreaking all sorts of evils on the natives. Knickerbocker then tells of a hunter who stole a gourd from the tree, which released a great stream that, quote, made its way to the Hudson and continues to flow to the present day, being the identical stream known by the name of the Kaaterskill. The final story shows how three cultures, German, Dutch, and indigenous, share suspicions that mountains possess unusual qualities, articulating these in culturally specific ways, and how these stories, like other stories of the war, end up as so many legends and names. The mountain and the stream can accept a variety of names, signs, without changing essential properties, just as signs can be repainted. That humans invent stories, and authorities capable of legitimating them, seems as ever-present as the mountain or the stream. The conclusion thus validates Knickerbocker's otherwise unorthodox approach. Talking to old Dutch wives reveals the truth of the humanist storyteller, ultimately more true than whatever fact might be certified within a book, although in adding indigenous perspectives unsettles the reader's appreciation of what makes it an American tale and tradition by reminding immigrants or their descendants that others preceded Finally, and equally important, beyond knitting together the beginning and ending of this sketch, Irving uses the logic of storytelling to provide a bridge to the author's account of himself, and the equivocation between fact and story that initiated Crayon's travels. This logic, rather than a causal plot, becomes the point of continuity reinforced within the reader's imagination. So there are four final implications. Number one, Irving begins his collection by orienting readers away from normative standards of truth, allowing both fable and news to stand as different interpretations of events beyond our ability to re-experience directly. Accepting as many sides of the story as possible ensures that we remain suspicious of the sole representation of truth and keeps us humble as we ramble through the world. Number two, Irving instructs us to the joys that come through peering at the world with the Gothic colored spectacles. It allows us to joyfully co-create the world with this sense of wonder, magic, and awe, and to become at home in the world through the work of intentional mediation instead of cultural imposition. Number three, Irving invests readers with the ethical authority of determining stories that are or are not believed. In our rambles throughout the world, we are able to become nimble thinkers and interpreters, embracing all biases instead of presuming that we stand in an unaffected center. Everything has a bias, and Irving reminds us of that. Finally, Irving exposes the repetitions that adhere to the world's logic in its political manifestations. The patterns repeat themselves. The signs only are superficial indications of change. Put into today's context, the differences between presidents remains far smaller than what we think. It's a battle waged to keep us from examining the real sources of power that persist through the seeming changes that distract